Hey everybody, Cabot Phillips here, Campus Reform Editor-in-Chief. We're joined today by a very special guest to talk about all things China. We've been covering all sorts of efforts of China to infiltrate college campuses. We have here an expert on US-China relations, Gordon Chang, author of Coming Collapse of China, as well as on Twitter, very popular account. Go follow him at Gordon G. Chang to keep up with all the latest information there. Mr. Chang, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, well, thank you, Cabot.
So we've been covering this at Campus Reform, and you are a man that knows a whole lot about China's efforts on the global stage. So for people that maybe haven't been paying as close attention to the battle that China is raging here within US borders, can you tell us a little bit about China's propaganda efforts and what they're trying to do as far as stealing research, things of that nature, and is it working?
Yeah, China is engaged in a broad-based propaganda campaign because it wants to control the narrative about what people say and think about China. So, for instance, the media, universities, all sorts of institutions, from the top to the bottom. And as part of this, China has also been trying to steal US intellectual property. It's been very successful in that regard. Estimates put the annual theft somewhere between 150 to $600 billion a year. And some of that actually occurs on college campuses. China has bought a number of college professors. A number of them have been fingered by the FBI in their pending investigations. And of course, Chinese students have been engaged in activities which are really inconsistent with their position in colleges. For instance, downloading entire databases for China. I'm not saying this is a widespread problem with regard to the students, but it certainly is widespread with regard to university professors, both Chinese Americans and those who are not Chinese Americans. This is just broad-based and pervasive.
And so what are their efforts? Have their efforts been ramped up with the coronavirus outbreak? Or are they doing this kind of thing now to try and cover up, the spread of coronavirus? Are they doing this to try and, make themselves seem less culpable? And are they doing this, trying to steal actual coronavirus research?
Well, there's been a number of things going on. So, for instance, the FBI just a couple of days ago warned about China trying to steal vaccine and vaccine-related research at university campuses as well as institutes. So this is a problem. And this is part of its broad-based effort to take US intellectual property, but it's also part of the effort of the Made in China 2025 initiative of Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler. Medicines and medicine-related equipment are one of the 10 areas that Xi Jinping has targeted for Chinese dominance by 2025. And of course, theft is a large part of China's initiative under that program. But also, we are seeing with the coronavirus an attempt by the Communist Party to change the narrative around the world. It started out that the coronavirus has an origin in Wuhan in central China. Beijing has tried to change that, at times, for instance, suggesting it came from the United States. That's the infamous March 12th tweet from a foreign ministry spokesman that said that patient zero was in the US and suggested that the US Army brought the coronavirus to Wuhan. But also what China's been trying to do afterwards is to say China has had a near perfect response to the coronavirus and that Western countries have been failing left, right, and center. So there's an attempt to exert Chinese influence. The one thing that we got to remember, Cabot, is that Xi Jinping believes that China is the world's only sovereign state. He harks back to these imperial era notions of Tianxia, mandate of heaven, where China ruled Tianxia, or all under heaven. And so we have to put China's initiatives into that context. And when we do, we have to be concerned what China does because its initiatives and its ambitions are malign.
And so in talking with people around the country about this, and I've gone to numerous campuses that have these Chinese-funded Confucius Institutes, and I've talked to students and administrators about the danger and how the DoD and the Defense Department have come out and said, these are centers of propaganda, that the Ministry of Propaganda in China has admitted that as well. And people don't seem to care. On campus, they say, well, we'll take them at their word that these are just cultural centers. What would be your message to administrators of these schools and students at these schools where you have these Confucius Institutes operating? What would be your message to them on why they should be a little more concerned?
Well, we know that although the Confucius Institutes report nominally to the Ministry of Education, they really are report in reality to the Communist Party's United Front Work Department. And that means these are attempts to subvert other countries. And why would China spend so much money on US campuses? It's not just because they want to teach Chinese language. It's because they want to put forth their narratives, and they want to restrict what is said about China on American campuses. And at some campuses with Confucius Institutes, Beijing has been very successful in essentially restricting freedom of speech and intimidating faculty members. For an overall perspective, the United States is not permitted to have institutes in China. So you couldn't have a Reagan Institute or a Roosevelt Institute or a Truman Institute. These are things which it's an issue of reciprocity. And we know that propaganda is absolutely critical to totalitarian regimes like China's. They don't mean us well. A year ago, in May of 2019, People's Daily, the most authoritative publication in China, declared a quote unquote people's war on the US. That shows malign intent.
Yeah. And so do you think that political correctness plays a role at all in people's failure to call this out or push back? I mean, do you think there's any element of, some of these schools or even elected officials being hesitant to push back on Chinese influence on campus because they don't want to be perceived as, bigoted or xenophobic or intolerant?
Yeah. What we have seen in the US is political correctness run wild in connection with the coronavirus epidemic, where any criticism of China is considered to be xenophobic or creating racism against Chinese Americans. And that's absolutely wrong. Got to remember that the Chinese regime is deeply racist with its Han nationalist ideology. This is something that we haven't quite seen since the Third Reich. And so to say that criticism of a racist regime is racist is absolutely wrong. People have serious concerns about China, and we have to have the right to have open discussions about it without the name calling, because I believe that all Americans have a common enemy right now. China has declared us to be an enemy, so we've got to react to this. And it's not racism, it's not xenophobic, it's just self-defense.
Yeah, and so over 25% of foreign exchange students in the United States are coming from China. And so obviously, you got to imagine that many of those students have no ill intentions. They're just coming here to try and study. Are there cases, though, where you have the Chinese government exploiting these students to where they're exploiting them for information, using them for espionage or propaganda efforts? And should that be a concern? Because that's something that I think a lot of people haven't touched on and don't know, how to make their mind up on that. Is that a concern at all?
Well, we know that it's a concern because Chinese diplomats and China's Ministry of State Security agents have operated on our campuses, not so much through the Confucius Institutes, but more through the Chinese Students and Scholars Association. And that's not to say that every chapter of CISA, as it's called, is bad. It's just that in many of them, we have seen actions which are inappropriate on the part of Chinese diplomats. Trying to censor and trying to intimidate faculty members. To me, this is a really personal issue because my dad was a Chinese student. He came to the US in February 1945, just before the end of the Second World War, got his master's degree in civil engineering in Cornell. But nonetheless, I am deeply concerned by the activities of what we see by the Chinese Communist Party and central government. And one other point, we can't forget that China enacted its national intelligence law in 2017, which requires every Chinese national and every Chinese entity to spy if demanded by Beijing. And that means that Chinese students are under a compulsion to spy. Now, it's up to us to make sure that they don't. It's up to us to make sure that they don't feel pressure from Beijing. And so part of this is really on us because this is our country and we can make sure that diplomats and Ministry of State Security agents don't operate.
And so in closing, you're someone that obviously is an expert on the issue. And if you were in a position, an elected official, if you were a university president, what kind of steps would you be taking to protect the next generation from Chinese propaganda? And what kind of steps would you be advising universities to take specifically? Obviously, there's a much broader political discussion to be had, but at the university level, what should schools be doing to protect themselves from Chinese influence?
So if a school has a Confucius Institute, I think that the first thing to do is to look at that agreement, because many of those agreements, first of all, require secrecy, and that's against the principle of academic inquiry and openness. So that really would be the first thing if my campus had a CI. And I'd also want to make sure that, as I was just talking about, that Chinese diplomats and Chinese agents don't unduly intimidate Chinese students. I mean, you can't ban all contact between a Chinese diplomat and, for instance, students on a campus, but you can make sure that those diplomats don't try to intimidate faculty members and all the rest of it. So there has to be no room for intimidation. And this means we've got to go forward very strictly on this, because our academic institutions are really the heart of open debate in the United States.
All right, we will leave it there. Could keep talking about this forever, but we know you're a busy man. Thank you so much for joining us. You guys have all seen him on TV talking about this. You've read his book, The Coming Collapse of China. Go follow him on Twitter at Gordon G. Chang. And please keep us up to date with everything. We'll continue monitoring the situation, but we appreciate all you're doing to keep us up to date on the conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Cabot. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on your channel.